This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dragon Mind, the TTRPG podcast where we discover our best selves through gaming. Today, we're going to be talking about the surprised Unearthed Arcana drop that happened yesterday with the 2024 Artificer. If you want to contact me directly, you can message me in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord or email me at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com, all linked in the description below. Yesterday was quite a surprise for the D&D community. I had just finished my script for the Practical Possibilities episode on Paladin when my little YouTube notification went off, saying that there was a new interview with Jeremy Crawford and Todd Kenrick about Unearthed Arcana Artificer, which is really surprising given that the 2025 Monster Manual hasn't even dropped yet. They haven't even finished up the core books, and already they're talking about additions to the new edition. So just to let you know up front, I did skim this 14-page document. The way I found it was just by clicking the description in the D&D YouTube channel's video description. I listened to the explanation by Jeremy Crawford, so I have some idea of the designer's headspace, but largely we're going to be discovering the nuances of this design together. So let's dive into it. Now, something to remember about Artificer is that in terms of design sensibilities, it's the only class that has been introduced after the release of the initial 12 core classes in the 2014 PHB. This was originally included in 2019's Eberron Rising from the Last War, and had a subclass added for 2020's Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, but other than that has been relatively untouched. Now, in order to preserve balance in both the Eberron and Tasha's version of the class really relies heavily on lists of specific items. However, while that ensures that it's balanced in its initial release, it doesn't allow the Artificer to keep up as more things get released. So in a lot of ways, what Jeremy Crawford pointed to is that the design of this Artificer is supposed to make it so that it can grow with the game, in the same way that when they were designing universal spell lists, homebrew classes could easily plug into these general lists that got added on over time. The goal of this new Artificer is that mechanics are more streamlined and easier to pick up and benefit from the rules changes of 2024, which, as I've stated in Practical Possibilities episodes, I tend to like how things have been more streamlined. So anyway, looking at it right off the bat, Artificer is still an intelligence-based character. The hit die hasn't changed, its saving throws are still con and intelligence, and it's basically the arcane half-caster, in the same way that Paladin is the divine half-caster and Ranger is the primal half-caster. What's funny is I'm not sure Artificer is getting updated to match those two, as much as those two got updated to match Artificer. You'll notice when I get to them in Practical Possibilities, both Paladin and Ranger gain their spell casting at first level, in the same way the Artificer has done since its initial inception. So the first change has to do right with its first feature. In the original version, magical tinkering allowed you to take a mundane object and give it one of a few properties, like allowing it to shed light or be able to record a message for another creature. Now, if you take a magic action and you're holding Tinker's Tools, you can just craft one of a list of mundane items that's in the player's handbook, like ball bearings, oil, a pole, or string. And you can just do that up to a number of times equal to your intelligence modifier. One thing I've said ever since reading just the player's handbook is that I think that the adventurer's gear section is probably going to be underrated. There are a lot of cool things you can do with these mundane items, which is why the thief subclass is particularly interesting. Now, of course, after an hour, whatever item you create with magical tinkering disappears, but I think it's kind of cool as a setup. This is like a MacGyver class. It rewards you for deep mechanical investment in the game, understanding the specific rules to all of these little items. And there is going to be a lot of budgeting and managing. Like right off the bat, not only do you have to track spell slots, you have to track your uses of magical tinkering. So for anyone that's at least curious about the Artificer, know going in this is going to be a high complexity class. Now, getting on to spellcasting, one thing Jeremy Crawford noted is that Artificer can switch cantrips after every long rest, while other classes can switch their cantrips. I think they have to do it on a level up. And so he wanted to make it so that only the intelligence casters, which are wizards and artificers, can swap their cantrips to make sure that they're like the most versatile of the spellcasters in that way. They also can use their tools as a spellcasting focus. And the idea here is this is just a mechanical way to encourage players to flavor their casting of spells as using their tools. So if you're going to use Acid Splash, it's like you take out a little vial and you splash somebody with acid. Yes, it's a cantrip. Yes, there's no limit based on how the rules of the game work. But flavor is free. So this is their way of trying to reconcile a streamlined system that already exists in the game with the flavor that the players are probably looking for. Now, that being said, Artificer is a half caster with a lower hit die than Rangers or Paladins. When Treant Monk did a power ranking of the 13 core classes of 2014, Artificer was second from the bottom. The only class weaker than it was the Monk. Now, that being said, I do think this is a good example of how you'll always have a weakest class. Really what you want to look at is the gap between the weakest and the strongest. I think 2024, for the most part, has done a good job of shrinking that gap, if not just complicating it by the fact that every class has a viable place in a party composition. And reading through the comments of the release video, no matter how powerful Artificer was, at least it was beloved by the people who really liked it. I mean, I've played an Artificer before, and I had a really good time with it. I think the downside to the 2014 Monk, to take a tangent, is the fact that it wasn't fun to play. And the fact that it wasn't fun to play had to do with that it was underpowered. There are times where playing an underpowered option is its own version of fun. I actually did a solo D&D game where I did an underpowered build, and that made it more exciting to see what would happen. But almost always failing is just as boring, in my opinion, as almost always succeeding, and that was the design flaw of the 2014 Monk. And I'll get to it at the end of Practical Possibilities, but the 2024 Monk is the class I'm most excited to play, and I've already built a character for a game I want to test out with it. Anyway, we're talking about Artificer today, so let's get back on track. So probably the biggest fundamental change to the Artificer's core mechanic is that infused item has been replaced with replicate magic item. The way Jeremy Crawford explained it, at least my interpretation of it, is that infused item was just a little too complicated for what they wanted to get across. So instead of having a set number of infusions, like invocations, Artificers have a number of plans that they can know. And at certain levels, they have access to certain plans, which we'll go over in a sec. But the idea is you aren't infusing a non-magical object with special magic. You are creating a magic item from the Dungeon Master's Guide. And like with spellcasting, there are recommendations. So imagine you're part of a level 2 party. The magic items you could replicate would be a bag of holding, a cap of water breathing, sending stones, and wand of the war mage +1. Now, I don't know how your D&D games usually run. In my experience playing ongoing campaigns, I tend not to see +1 items until at least level 3 or 4. And I think that gets into really where the Artificer might fit in a party composition. Honestly, a lot of it is going to depend on how many magic items the DM gives out. I've definitely played in campaigns where the DM tended to be stingier with magic items. And I've talked about this story before, but it's relevant here too. One of my first games, I was playing a fighter. I didn't even get a magic weapon until level 8. And so what was happening is I was in a game with a warlock. The warlock would be blasting with the same damage die. Every time I'd hit, it'd end up with, well, sorry, this creature is resistant to slashing damage. And as a fighter, especially in 2014, with just the player's handbook rules, there wasn't really anything else I could do. It was basically like, oh, sorry, this enemy, you can't deal with them. And it was really frustrating because I had no access to be able to overcome the obstacle that the DM had put in front of me. Now, if we had an Artificer in the party, at level 2, they could have just given me a +1 weapon with Replicate magic item. And so, Artificer becomes more and more valuable the stingier your DM is going to be with handing out magic item rewards. That being said, the new Dungeon Master's Guide, in my opinion, tends to encourage being really generous with giving out magic items. And while I can see Artificers being valuable in that type of game environment, I can see how they would be less powerful because they're less necessary. It might be you get a +1 weapon really soon, so instead the Artificer is now coming up with these utility plans like Bag of Holding or Cap of Water Breathing to just kind of fill in the gaps. Anyway, I do want to go over these magic item plan lists because I do think they're really interesting. So if you're an Artificer level 2, the plans that you unlock are an Alchemy Jug, Bag of Holding, Cap of Water Breathing, a common magic item that isn't a potion, scroll, or cursed. That was a big thing they talked about. As an Artificer, you can't create a cursed magic item. I don't know why you'd want to. I guess you could try to trick an enemy to try to attune to it. I think it makes sense to keep curses as a separate thing. Anyway, you can also get Goggles of Night, Rope of Climbing, Sending Stones, a +1 shield, Wand of Magic Detection, Wand of Secrets, +1 Wand of the War Mage, and a +1 weapon. Now, once you hit level 6, you're going to unlock +1 armor, Boots of Elvenkind, Cloak of Elvenkind, Cloak of the Manta Ray, Eyes of Charming, Gloves of Thievery, Lantern of Revealing, Pipes of Haunting, and then an uncommon armor, wand, or weapon. And these ones you can learn this option multiple times to select a different item for each one. And then as you hit the higher levels, like level 10, you can make any uncommon ring or wondrous item that isn't cursed. And then level 14 and up, that becomes a rare armor, ring, wand, weapon, wondrous item that isn't cursed. So while the lower levels stay more specific so that things don't get out of hand, you can see that even from level 6 and up, you start to unlock options that are more and more useful. And at level 14, I think you're gonna have at least a player or two that has like a very rare item. So it's not like the Artificer is circumnavigating the entire reward system, but they are providing a unique value in either boosting your party's offense and defense or providing those unique utility options where you really need the right tool for the right situation. Now, I can already see potential based on this design for optimizers to exploit these plans in this way, but it's like a lot of things in the game. I mean, in 2014, listening to Trant Monk and Pack Tactics, I don't even know if they're worth being called horror stories, but it's more like there were ways to optimize certain multi-classes like Wizard and Cleric to basically create this super powerful full spellcaster that had all the strength of martials without any of the downsides. Even though these exploits existed in the rules, D&D is a game of a social contract, and that's only allowed if your social contract allows for it. Now, I'm not against optimization of characters, but I do think it's worth a conversation if there's a certain rules combination that becomes exploitative rather than just letting the whole party have fun. And so I think that's a great thing to remember when analyzing this design. The design is meant for Artificer to keep up with the game. So you have to ask yourself, is it worth an exploit or two sneaking through, which may just lead to a social conversation with your players of just being like, hey, can you not? Or is it worth shutting off all the possibilities of the Artificer growing with the game because of fear of these exploitations? I think a really good example of that, even in the 2024 PHB, is just Conjure Minor Elementals. That's a really powerful spell that kind of seems like it was a mistake. Like, the damage is just a little too high given its level. So if I had a player interested in Conjure Minor Elementals, I might just give them a warning or something about its power, or maybe give a side effect story-wise for using it. Just because it's printed in the book doesn't mean it has to ruin the fun of your game. So Right Tool for the Job, from what I'm seeing in Tasha's, used to kind of be a version of what magical tinkering is now. In this playtest version, it just says now you can create artisans tools as part of magical tinkering. I think that's fine. I don't think it needs to be any more complicated than that. And then of course level 3, like every other class in the game, is when you would get your Artificer subclass, which we'll save for a little bit. Alright, on to level 6, which is Magic Item Tinker. This is adjusting your replicate magic item with 2 new options. So first is Drain Magic Item. As a bonus action, you can touch a magic item within 5 feet of yourself that you created with Replicate Magic Item and cause the item to vanish, converting its magical energy into a spell slot. And based on the rarity, it gives you a different spell slot level. So if it's a common magic item, the slot is 1. If it's uncommon or rare, the slot is 2. And you can only use this feature once per long rest. Hey, remember when I was doing the Bard Practical Possibilities episode where I talked about how much I liked having Bardic Inspiration be a reaction? Flash of Genius was that you can use a reaction when you watch a creature make an ability check or saving throw to add your intelligence modifier to the roll. I've always ruled it this way. I know that might be controversial, but apparently the playtest version is you watch them fail an ability check or saving throw, and then you can use the reaction. So that way you're not wasting your Flash of Genius just in case they roll really high. And of course, this is another feature, you have to keep track of the budget. You can use this reaction a number of times equal to your intelligence modifier, regaining all expended uses on a long rest. The last one is Soul of Artifice. So the old version was that you got kind of a relentless endurance effect of if you're reduced to 0 hit points, you can use your reaction to end an Artificer infusion and drop to 1 instead, and you get a +1 bonus to all saving throws per magic item you're currently attuned to. Now, the Soul of Artifice cheat death has been buffed a little bit, so now you don't have to use a reaction, but you do have to disintegrate a uncommon or rare magic item that you created with Replicate Magic Item. But instead of going up to 1, you get to 20, so there's a greater chance you're not going to get knocked down again. And you can use it multiple times around because the original version required a reaction, this one doesn't. Now, instead of the +1 to saves, when you have attunement to at least 1 magic item, you can add 1d6 to any ability check you make, and you decide to add the die after rolling the d20, and you can use the benefit once per turn. In my opinion, this is a lot weaker. So they buffed up the cheat death option. They nerfed the other option, mostly because ability checks don't mean what they used to mean in 2014. I mean, adding the 1d6 is cool. It's just, especially at level 20, I don't think whether or not you succeed your investigation check is going to mean as much as getting +6 to all your saving throws. And even though cheat death is a little easier to use, the other version just said you have to end an infusion, which, if we're looking at the comparisons with Replicate Magic Item, basically means you could have made some common magic items for the explicit purpose of cheating death. This says it's gotta be uncommon or rare, which means you're losing a significant benefit to cheat death. Now, most games probably aren't going to be at level 20, unless, of course, you're doing a one-shot. But still, I think that this is overall kind of a nerf from the 2020 version. Overall, listening to what their design goals were, thinking how excited I would be to play the class, I think it's pretty well designed. I think it's like an 8 out of 10. I think that there might be some ways to exploit the way that the rules are written, and I think it's a little easier to pick up for most players than the original version. That being said, I think the people that would be most excited to play Artificer would be either DMs that get the chance to be a player, individuals that are really knowledgeable about all the uncommon, wondrous magic items that they could make with Replicate magic item, and for players that really don't need to be the star of the show, ones that just want to make sure that their friends are taken care of, but also don't want to get bogged down with decisions in the moment. Taking some downtime to select some magic items that are going to help is a great way to contribute and make your friends stronger without drawing unnecessary spotlight to yourself. Of course, I could also see it being attractive to really invested players, like players that love getting into the nitty-gritty of mechanics, and players that tend to be a little more industrial, players that like to create and craft things. I think these rules are a little less complicated and a little more open than the 2020 version, especially with Replicate magic item instead of the infusions. So that being said, when it comes to infusions, there were some that allowed you to create magic items that were only accessed through infusions. Some of these included Boots of the Winding Path, Helm of Awareness, Mind Sharpener. At the end of this doc, they've just been made into general magic items, and I think this is a good way to go. Also, it's presented as a new spell, but really it's an infusion created into a spell, which is Homunculus Servant, a level 2 conjuration. It's basically an alternative kind of familiar. So moving on to the Artificer subclasses, they already have 4 subclasses. The classes haven't changed. It's still Alchemist, Armorer, Battlesmith, and Artillerist. So we'll go right in alphabetical order, starting with the Alchemist. In 2014, Treant Monk noted that this was one of the weaker subclasses of a weaker core class. I don't think it's going to change its power ranking position all that much, but to be honest, I liked playing an Alchemist. I think the biggest change has to do with Experimental Elixir. This is kind of like the wild magic of the Artificer subclasses. After you finish a long rest while holding alchemist supplies, basically you use your alchemist supplies to make these, you magically produce 2 elixirs, and as a bonus action, you could either drink the elixir or administer it to another creature within 5 feet. And as a magic action, you could expend a spell slot to create another elixir, and you get to choose from the elixirs rather than rolling. Now, comparing the experimental elixirs table from the old version with the new one, most of them are still the same, like swiftness, boldness. In particular, the healing option is a lot better. Instead of 2d4, it's 2d8 plus intelligence modifier. Now, over the weekend, I played in a session where I played a redesigned Valor Bard. And we were in the middle of combat, and the Paladin who we were using for Aura of Protection, because there were a lot of saving throw effects, went down to 0. And for the first time ever, I was looking at my character sheet, and because of the new healing word scaling, where using a second level slot would give me 4d4, it actually made sense for me to upcast a healing spell. Never thought I'd ever do that. And it ended up working really well. So just that's a commentary on the new healing scaling is just much better balanced than it was in the old edition. The other thing is that this is a D6 table, and the 6th option used to be transformation, where there is an alter self effect. In this new table, it's just you determine the elixir's effect by choosing one of the other rows. So when you're coming up with your experimental elixirs after a long rest, then you have the option to be able to pick if you roll a 6. And remember, as far as I can tell, you can hand these elixirs to other players. So level 9 is Restorative Reagents. Whenever a creature drinks an elixir you created with experimental elixir, the creature gained temporary hit points. It used to be 2d6 plus intelligence modifier, which isn't bad, but now it's intelligence modifier plus artificer level, which is way better. When you get this at level 9, that's already greater than the average of 2d6, which would be 7. And that's only going to get better as you go up. Now, Chemical Mastery has also been just completely redesigned. So first, it gives you resistance to acid and poison damage. It used to also give you immunity to the poisoned condition, but it no longer does that. Also, when you use an Artificer spell that deals acid, fire, necrotic, or poison, you get to also deal 2d8 force damage to the target, which is an interesting way to increase the Artificer's damage output. Not sure how much that 2d8 is going to matter when you're level 15 fighting level 15 things, but it's better than nothing. And instead of Greater Restoration or Heal, now you can cast Tasha's Bubbling Cauldron without expending a spell slot. This is a much more flavorful option. Not sure how effective it is, because I haven't seen Tasha's Bubbling Cauldron in play. But it is an interesting experimental version of the subclass. Overall, I do like the Alchemist's design. Not sure how strong it is, especially looking at the redesigns for the other core classes. But again, as someone who's a DM a lot of the time, as a player, I think this would be an interesting support build to play, especially since it gives you a little bit of randomness with the experimental elixirs. So up next is the Armorer. Now, this is kind of like the magical Iron Man subclass. Originally, at level 3 when you got it, you would choose one of two models that your armor would take. There was the Guardian, which was more the tanky option. It gave you a d8 thunder damaging weapon. Or the Infiltrator, which would increase your speed and be more of kind of like a stealth option. Now, there's a third one, which is the Dreadnought. You get a giant armor flail, which is a 1d10 bludgeoning damage with reach. Kind of interesting. And kind of like all the giant subclasses that have gotten released in the past few books, as a bonus action, the armor can enlarge for a minute. It gives you a reach increase by 5 feet. Of course, if you have an aura on it, that increases by 5 feet. And the Wrecking Ball allows you to push or pull a creature 10 feet from or toward yourself. I think Dreadnought, dare I say, might be the most powerful from a combat perspective of the 3 armor options. But again, anytime I get a menu of options, having a triplicate of choice, having 3 of them, I feel is kind of a sweet spot when it comes to my design sensibilities. Again, overall, I think people were happy with Armorer. It needed just a little bit of design massaging, and adding in a third option certainly makes it more interesting. Next up is the Artillerist. Interesting how many Artificer subclasses start with the letter A. Little has been changed with this subclass's core game mechanic. The only big difference is that Eldritch Cannon used to be one of 3 options that you'd pick, and the cannon did that thing. So either it could be a flamethrower, a force ballista, or a protector. When you created the cannon, you would pick one of those things, and that's what it would do. Now, every Eldritch Cannon is all of those things, and you can pick turn by turn which of the 3 effects you'd like to activate. So it's just a little more versatile than it was in the older version. Explosive Cannon also now detonates as a reaction instead of an action, and its damage increased, which I think makes more sense from both the story perspective and makes it a little bit more usable from an action economy perspective. And the Battlesmith, believe it or not, has had the least amount of updates. The Steel Defender now just has a bunch more hit points, and Force Empowered Rend, which used to do 1d8 plus proficiency bonus damage, now does 1d8 plus 2 plus intelligence modifier, rather than 1d8 plus 2 when you get the subclass. Likely it's going to be more like 1d8 plus 5 or plus 6 a lot earlier. So it's not going to scale over time, but you're getting the higher part of the scaling curve just a lot earlier. Overall, I'm mostly curious to hear what the Optimizer folks have to say about the Artificer. In my eyes, from my experience playing an Artificer, seeing Artificers at the table, and just having played with a few different kinds of players and player personalities, I think that this is mostly an appropriate design. Again, Artificer was designed 5 years after the 2014 PHB. The designers had a lot more data gathered when going into designing this class than they did with the core classes. They could see what was working, what wasn't, how players actually played the game versus how they thought they would. So it would make sense that they wouldn't want to change too much. That, and again, people seemed satisfied with the Artificer's design. I'm really curious to hear what your thoughts are on the UA Artificer. Let me know in the comments down below or in the Dragon Mind discussion channel of the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Dragon Mind is a proud member of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. To discover more TTRPG content like this, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com. If you had any insights or questions, be sure to email us at dragonmindpodcast@gmail.com or post in our discussion channel in the Darkmoor Podcast community Discord, linked in the description below. Our theme song, J-Pop, is brought to you by Thesleyan Studios. You can check out more of their awesome work at thesleyanstudios.com. Have an awesome day, and remember, your story matters. Bye-bye now.
Well, Grimton, Morlinde and Ulrich are gone. We're in a new, unfamiliar land of Kolgafir. What's our first move?
Polaris, I'm not too certain, but I did hear Fishbelly talking about something.
Oh, yeah. With the Warlord's half-sister in a meeting.
Yeah, that's about the only lead we have so far. We haven't been here long. Might be worth checking out.
Seems like a plan to me.
Join us as our party explores an unforgiving region of the Cusp and allies with new party members in Arc 3 of Advantage, a 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons audio drama focused on storytelling and character development in the Darkmoor Podcast Network. Find us in your podcast app.